In Washington, one debate will have a more profound effect on your economic future than perhaps any other. The debate over annual federal deficits and the national debt. Some of you may not have engaged in the debate, though, in part because many people confuse the terms debt and deficit. Economist Stan Kolander.
It's a very understandable kind of problem because, one, they both start with DE, but two, they're difficult concepts to understand.
Or at least they're difficult enough.
The distinction between the federal debt and the federal deficit.
The federal debt and the federal deficit. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm a science student, so.
Federal debt, federal deficit. What's the difference?
What's the difference between the federal debt and the federal deficit?
Debt and deficit. Good question.
Not a clue.
Not a clue.
Honestly, no idea.
I don't know. I've thought about that a little, but I've never really researched that.
But one student knew the distinction so well, she even had an image for it.
I think you could describe the debt as being similar to a hole in the ground that you dig out yearly, and the amount of dirt that you dig out is what the deficit is in a year, and then the hole, as it gets bigger and bigger, is what the debt is.
Visualizing this, the deficit is the shortfall in any single year between federal income and federal spending. The debt is the cumulative hole we're digging for ourselves by running years and years of deficits. When Uncle Sam runs a budget surplus in any given year, he's reducing the debt, filling in the hole, but that's only happened 5 times in the last 40 years, 4 of them at the end of the Clinton administration in the 90s, before 9/11 and the Bush tax cuts. In general, the hole's gotten deeper and deeper ever since the country was born. Starting with $75 million back in 1791, the federal debt held fairly steady into the 19th century. Surpluses almost eliminated it by 1835. But deficits to pay for the Civil War increased the federal debt past the billion-dollar mark in 1863, where it pretty much leveled off until the U.S. entered World War I in 1917. The next big move came with the deficits to pay for World War II, driving the national debt above $200 billion, where it more or less stayed until the 1960s. We went further into hock in the 70s, and in the 1980s, the Reagan administration both cut taxes and increased spending, resulting in heftier deficits and an increasingly steep rise in the debt that passed $1 trillion in 1982 and has just kept going since.
Borrow up to $100,000 or more.
In 1990, I tried to dramatize the process to my generation by playing the role of the U.S. government on public TV, applying for a loan at the widely advertised lender of that era, the money store.
If you need money for any reason at all, the money store is the place to go.
What is your name?
Paul Solomon, but I'm actually here on behalf of the United States of America.
The United States of America. How much do you want to borrow?
Today, we need about $10 billion.
$10 billion. $10 billion? How long do you need it for?
30 years. We'd like to borrow it for 30 years.
What is the total amount of your debts outstanding?
Actually, just over $3 trillion.
$3 trillion. That's a lot of money. May I ask what your income is?
Income's about $1 trillion a year.
And what are your expenses?
About $1.2 trillion, something close to that, yeah.
You're running into a deficit each year.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Actually, for the last 10 years, we've been running into one pretty consistently. Yeah.
Well, if you're running into a deficit, how do you anticipate being able to repay the $10 billion?
The idea is that over time, expenses would go down and the economy would grow, and so we'd take in more in taxes and balance the budget ultimately.
Indeed, this is just what defenders of the debt say. Don't look at the absolute amount of debt, the red line. Look instead at this green line, the debt as a percentage of the economy as a whole. Here and historically, the economy is represented by gross national product, or GNP, a close relative of the number we now use, GDP. As you can see, when comparing these two different measures, the debt climb of the last 50 years looks a lot less dramatic. On this chart, you can see spikes for the Civil War, World Wars I and II, The Reagan run-up seems modest by comparison.
I'll buy whatever you got. I'll buy whatever you got.
Now, the way the U.S. actually covered its annual deficits wasn't to borrow from the money store, but, as it always has, from investors via the bond market. Annual deficit of $200 billion in 1990? Borrow the money from the public via the bond market by issuing U.S. Treasury IOUs, bonds, bills, and notes, the names of IOUs for different length loans, from 30 years down to 30 days.
Okay, everybody to the man is bearish.
The IOUs were then, in the 1980s, and are now, auctioned off to investors. That's what these bond traders were doing, buying IOUs for Japanese investors who owned this firm and were willing to lend to the U.S. if the interest rate was high enough.
Hit 4 bonds, up 4 bonds.
In the subsequent half-dozen years, the early 1990s, both expenses and the economy grew, but expenses grew faster. As Uncle Sam sold more and more IOUs to cover his deficits, he continued to increase our cumulative national debt. And despite the late 90s Clinton surpluses, the U.S. owed nearly $7 trillion by the end of 2003, back up above 60% of a year's economic output, the second highest level it's been in the history of the Republic. And it's growing sharply, which suggests much more borrowing. Now, the problem with the debt hole, as with any debt, is that the more you owe, the more your interest payments grow. Think about the federal budget. The more interest payments Uncle Sam has to make on the national debt, the less money available for everything else. Your college student loan, my father's Social Security, your grandmother's Medicare, our Homeland Security. In fact, interest payments now make up about 9% of the entire U.S. budget. After going down for a few years, they're growing faster than the economy is, meaning the ratio of interest to the annual budget is becoming larger. There's also a second problem with a growing federal debt. When the government borrows heavily, it competes with private borrowers, like businesses, and crowds them out. Because, says economist Robert Reischauer, the government is borrowing from the same pool of money the businesses are.
It takes some of that available pool to finance the difference between federal spending and federal revenues, leaving less available for private businesses.
Many economists believe that in running deficits, governments compete with private businesses for the world's money, and in so doing drive up interest rates. That in turn makes long-term business investments less attractive, since all else equal, they have to be more profitable to pay off the interest on their debt. But some other politicians and economists argue in favor of deficits. The argument for the tax cuts of President George W. Bush, for instance, especially his tax cuts on business, was that they would stimulate investment and thus long-term growth more than they would stifle it with increased deficits.
It is true, on the one hand, that deficits put modest upward pressure on interest rates. On the other hand, this tax change the president has proposed increases long-term growth. We think that the effect of the economy of the growth effects of what the president's proposing outweigh the effects of the deficit on interest rate.
But so what if robust long-term growth doesn't materialize after all? Who cares? You do, says Robert Reischauer, or at least you certainly should.
Students should care more than people my generation should care, because they will live with the consequences of the fiscal irresponsibility of their fathers and grandfathers.
In fact, Robert Reischauer, I, and the rest of our baby boom generation are your fathers and grandfathers. And not only has Uncle Sam been borrowing to give us tax cuts, we're about to retire in record numbers, which Uncle Sam will have to borrow more to pay for. Again, if the economy grows even faster, no problem. But if it doesn't, interest payments will eat up more and more of the budget, and at some point, your taxes will presumably have to be raised to pay for him and me. Meanwhile, in the time you've been watching this video, the national debt has gone up about $10 million. The hole some $10 million deeper than when we began this about 10 minutes ago.